Can you believe all of these strokes and marks were made with one brush? It's not a liner or a rigger, it's not a round brush, it's not a flat brush. It's more like all three in one. It's a dagger brush, also sometimes called a sword brush. This brush has a reputation for being uncontrollable and frustrating. But if you know how to use it, it's one of the most useful watercolor brushes. Maybe you have one of these brushes but don't know how to use it, or you're wondering if a dagger brush is worth adding to your brush collection. Today, I want to show you exactly how to use this brush and everything you can do with it when you know how to control it. Once you see how useful and versatile this brush is, you'll understand why it's one of my most used brushes. The belly of the brush holds a ton of paint, but the angled bristles come to a very fine point. The first thing I like to do with any brush is see what kind of marks it can make. This brush has a unique shape that makes a variety of marks depending on how you hold it. There are 4 different ways to hold this brush. If you hold it upright, you can use the tip to make small dots. If you turn the brush over on its back so the angled side of the bristles is pointing up, you can use the tip of the brush to make these larger pointed marks. With the angled side of the brush down, you can stamp short lines. If you pull the brush to the side or down, it makes marks like a flat brush. These will be the same width as the angle of the bristles. You can also use this brush on its side to make marks similar to the brush shape. The marks are pointed on one end and rough on the wider end of the mark. I'm demonstrating today with a 1/4-inch dagger brush by Princeton Neptune. It's the one I use the most often. I also have the Princeton Neptune 1/2-inch dagger and a Princeton Velvetouch 1/4-inch miniature dagger striper. At the end, I'll show you how these brushes compare to this one. Links for all 3 of these brushes are in the video description below. Now let's look at all the strokes we can make by holding the brush in these 4 different ways. After that, I'll show you some special techniques you can do with this brush. When you hold the brush like this with just the tip touching the paper, you can paint long, thin lines. Because the brush holds so much paint, you can keep going for a long time before you need to reload the brush. By varying the pressure on the tip, you can go from a thin stroke to a slightly wider stroke, but there's not a lot of variation. This stroke is useful for painting grasses. Hold the brush upright and flick the brush away from you. Because you don't get a lot of variation when you apply pressure to the tip, the strokes stay fairly consistent and you can make a lot of strokes before needing to reload the brush. It's also easy to paint fur or hair with this brush. You can also use the tip of the brush to paint branches with a nice organic look. I'll show you an easy way to use the dagger brush to add leaves to this branch in a moment. If you flip the brush over on its back so the angled side of the bristles is pointing up, you can also use the tip of the brush to paint long, thin strokes. But notice when you hold the brush this way, it releases more paint than holding it upright on the tip. When you apply pressure, you can make the stroke much wider. When held this way, the dagger brush behaves more like a round brush. For long leaves, you can start with a nice point, add pressure to make the stroke wider, and then twist back up to the tip to finish with a point. This stroke is useful for painting wider grass blades or plants with long, slender leaves. It's great for palm leaves too. I also love holding the dagger brush this way to paint smaller leaves on trees. I always get frustrated painting leaves with the tip of a round brush because the marks always look too similar and repetitive. I find it's easier to create a variety of leafy marks with the dagger brush. So to recap, for thin, consistent strokes, hold the brush upright and paint with the tip. For wider strokes or stroke variation, hold the brush on its back with the angled side up and paint with the tip of the brush this way. To get the widest stroke possible with this brush, paint with the angled side touching the paper. It paints more like a flat brush when you hold it this way. You can paint wide strokes and large washes relatively quickly. You can make several passes before needing to reload the brush. When the brush is nearly out of paint, you can create dry brush textures. You can also use the angled edge to paint flower petals by rotating the brush around the tip. This technique does take a little bit of practice to get used to. You can wiggle the brush back and forth a bit to create more ruffled edges on the petals. If you like to paint flowers, stick around because there's another cool trick you can do with this brush coming up soon. You can also twirl the brush all the way around to paint circles. It's not as easy to control as other brushes, but with the angled side down, you can paint large circles. If you turn the brush over so the angle side is facing up, you can paint smaller circles. The other way you can hold this brush is on its side. It's a great way to paint leaf shapes. You can paint one side of the leaf, then flip the brush over to paint the other side, leaving a small white gap for the vein. Here's an example of an abstract leaf pattern I painted using this technique. You can also paint loose leaves with rough ends. One of the best things about this brush is you can paint the stems and leaves in one go. Start on the tip to paint the stem and then press the brush down on its side to create the leaves. You can also take advantage of the brush's straight edge to paint rocks, mountains, islands, or cloud shapes with a flat bottom. One of my favorite ways to use this brush is to fill in complex shapes. With its fine point and ability to hold a lot of paint, this brush is amazing for outlining and filling in shapes. If you try to paint a shape like this star with a round brush, you might choose to use a smaller round brush to outline the edges of the shape, but that brush won't hold enough paint to fill it in quickly. So you either make a ton of small strokes to fill it in or have to switch to a second larger brush. Either way, you run the risk of blotchiness and uneven drying. The dagger brush, however, can do it all. I use the tip of the brush to outline the edges of the shape and then turn the brush on its side to quickly fill in the shape while the outline is still wet. With practice, you can paint really uniform shapes with neat edges. Instead of constantly reloading a small brush, you can use a dagger brush to quickly and neatly outline and fill in shapes. And it's not just for large shapes. The dagger is great for smaller shapes too. For smaller shapes, I use the tip to outline and then turn the brush on its back to fill in the shape. If you notice too much paint puddling in a smaller shape, you can remove some of the paint from the dagger brush before painting the shape, or lift out excess paint with a clean, damp brush afterward. The dagger brush is also my favorite brush for negative painting, which is where you paint the background around a shape. It's a technique usually done in multiple layers, and with each additional layer, there's more shapes that you're trying to paint around. With the dagger brush, I can paint precise edges and fill in large areas of the background without switching brushes. Another cool thing you can do with this brush, which doesn't work that well with most watercolor brushes, is double loading. That's where you have two paint colors on the same brush. With the dagger brush, you can load the belly of the brush with a lighter color and then add a darker or more concentrated color at the tip of the brush. When you paint with the double loaded brush, you get this two-toned gradient effect. Double loading is a fun way to paint leaves. You can paint long leaves using the back of the brush, and the darker color will be most concentrated at the base of the leaf. You can also do two-stroke leaves. Hold the brush on its side with the flat part facing you. The darker color on the tip will run along the vein of the leaf. Holding the brush the same way, paint the stroke on the other side of the vein, and the darker color will run along the bottom edge of the leaf. This gives your leaves instant shading. This is a cool technique, but it does take some practice to get used to loading the brush, getting the paint concentrations right, and painting the leaf shapes. You can also use double loading to paint flower petals. I loaded the belly of the brush with a watery pink mix and added a thicker yellow mix at the tip of the brush. The yellow appears at the tip of the petal, but the two colors blend seamlessly together on the paper. With some practice, you can create two-tone flower petals in one stroke. You can also use double loading when painting grasses or stripes. When the color runs out on the tip of the brush, the color in the belly of the brush will be released. It's an easy way to get a variegated look. Let's look at how these dagger brushes compare. They all work the same, just at different scales. I put links to all three of these brushes in the video description below. I've been using this 1/4" dagger brush for the entire video. It's my personal favorite and the size I recommend most people start with. I think it's the perfect size if you normally paint at 10 by 14" or smaller sizes. I also have the 1/2" Princeton Neptune dagger brush, and you can see it's a big jump up in size. This one is really fun, but it's best for artists that paint larger and are used to mixing up a lot of paint. You'll want to have full-size pans or mix directly from the tube. I recently got this miniature dagger striper, and you can see how much smaller it is. I don't use this one much, but I would recommend it if you like to paint really small. Relative to its size, it holds a lot of paint and would give you all the benefits of a dagger in a miniature size. If you have a dagger brush, I hope you've grabbed it by now to try some of these strokes. If not, what are you waiting for? It's going to be your new favorite brush. If you don't have a dagger brush yet, I hope this video helped you decide if it's right for you and the way you paint.